Hello and good morning, everyone. My name is Jillian Bender-Cormier. I'm brand manager with Bender Insurance Solutions. We want to welcome you to another educational BenderU webinar on how to keep your organization clean with good cyber hygiene. Some housekeeping notes. At the end of this webinar, we will have an engaging Q&A session that I will be facilitating. If you have any questions during the webinar, please feel free to type them into the chat box or in the Q&A section. During that dedicated Q&A time near the end of the presentation, I'll be sharing your questions with our speaker. We want to be conscious of time, so if we don't get to answer all of your questions, we will gladly reach out to you individually after the webinar. You are all in listen-only mode and will remain muted throughout the webinar. This session is being recorded, and at the conclusion of the webinar, both the recording link and slide deck will be forwarded to you. We have a fantastic expert sharing with us this morning, but I'll let Bender's own technology risk advisor, Brian Murray, do the honor of introducing them. Welcome, Brian.
Thank you very much, Jillian. So I'm really excited about today's BenderU. Cybersecurity is such an important topic right now, and I know you're going to get a ton of good info out of this webinar. It's my pleasure to introduce our presenter today. Their experience is phenomenal, but they're also entertaining, down to earth, and can make even this complex material seem easy to understand. Britt Barnes has been in the security world for 14 years, with the first decade spent as a security manager in the US Air Force, and continues today as a fusion intelligence analyst in the California Air National Guard. Britt completed their master's in IT security management and is a certified information systems security professional and certified ethical hacker. Currently, they're the manager of the strategic security section at Taborda Solutions, a local company that focuses on creating and ensuring security compliance programs and practices. Britt leads key initiatives such as governance, compliance, risk management, which we love, auditing, and self-inspections, as well as developing and maintaining policies and security programs. So that is enough of me. Thank you again very much for doing this, Britt, and take it away.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Brian and Jillian, for hosting me. I was super happy to be able to talk about, anything security. That is definitely my passion. And this is a quick overview of what we're going to talk about today. So, hopefully it's engaging and exciting to you, even if it's, maybe a little bit complicated. And definitely drop any questions into the chat, and I'm looking forward to having the opportunity to answer them. So quick overview of what we'll be discussing. Cyber hygiene, obviously, is a big thing, and then the challenges around cybersecurity, and then some relevant security frameworks and the benefits of actually using a framework. So let's jump in. I'm sure you all signed up for this webinar just, for any good reason, but maybe that reason was just to kind of better understand what the term cyber hygiene is. It's something that's been thrown around a lot, and it's not just washing your hands, right? So there's a relatively small number of root causes for these major data breaches that are happening, malware, ransomware, that kind of thing, right? And I'm going to talk about it later, but I just read an article from Reuters that actually referenced cyber hygiene, and I shared it on my LinkedIn, so maybe you saw that. And the idea around cyber hygiene is that there's a small number of root causes responsible for many security incidences. And those root causes can be anything from attackers using your employees' credentials that maybe were stolen during a data breach, or they exploited a common vulnerability that's on your public-facing website, and I know it's kind of a simplistic example, but if there was a magic bullet that you knew that you could implement and that would reduce your chance of a security breach by up to 85%, would you really question doing it? And I pose that in this way because, as I'll get to in a little bit, the NIST cybersecurity framework is actually proven that if you implement basic security steps, which in this case we're calling cyber hygiene, then you can reduce your cyber risk by up to 85%, right? And then similarly, let's say if you were able to travel back in time and say, hey, our network is going to have a ransomware attack in 6 months, and oh, by the way, it's going to be facilitated by this Russian-backed threat group, would you, bother making changes to try and stop that attack from happening, right? So these kind of simplistic examples are just kind of a way to get down to the root cause of what a cyber attack is, right? So there's generally two flavors. There's email risk compromise, and then there's computer database breaches. And those are the two most popular versions of security, security breaches. And we know that the majority of them are caused by just this small amount of incidents or the vulnerabilities. Now, cyber hygiene is often easier said than done, right? So a good example of this is something like just patching software, patching your desktop operating systems or applications and that kind of thing. So we know that patching helps eliminate vulnerabilities. And even though there's this widespread recognition that patching can be incredibly effective in mitigating security risk, patching those individual resources can be very time intensive and resource intensive. And also the idea of putting together a holistic patch management program is often too much for a small organization. So if you were to take away anything from today's presentation, I would hope that it's the understanding of exactly what cyber hygiene is. And again, it's the few couple things that are responsible for the vast majority of breaches and what we do as an organization in order to try and mitigate those, right? So I shouldn't have, you shouldn't have to say, but why is hygiene important? Is cyber hygiene? And the answer to that is, just in 2021 alone, a basic, Google search got me around 40-ish major data breaches. And in this case, I'm calling major as headline grabbing, and also, in one of those lists of the top 25 worst breaches so far of the last decade. Now, for context, in 2020, there were over 30,000 security incidents across the globe. And I'm going to reference this Verizon data breach report that just came out a couple months ago. And they were able to go through these 30,000 security instances for 2020, and they identified over 5,000 that were confirmed data breach. So a security incident can be some kind of security flaw, whereas a data breach is actually exfiltrating and stealing that data out of your network. So if that one, if this one doesn't grab your attention, I don't know what will. I know that most people have already read the news about the Colonial Pipeline. You might have been affected by it directly when, people were starting to hoard gas. And the Colonial Pipeline is essentially the head of Colonial Pipeline told US senators just a couple days ago that hackers were able to get into their systems by sealing just a single password, right? And they used a legacy VPN, and in the IT world, legacy is generally just means an old type of VPN. And that legacy system had been using single factor authentication. So they had a single password that was not protected by multi-factor. And in this article by Reuters that was talking about this Senate hearing, it actually literally said security experts call the use of single factor login a sign of poor cybersecurity hygiene, right? So this is timely. Unfortunately, it's happening more and more. We also had like a meat packing company that had been shut down. And even if you are part of a private business and maybe not public sector, it's still really important to understand in general why cyber hygiene is important to the entire framework and support system of the United States, right? So obviously, critical infrastructure, very important. What does this mean to you from a business standpoint or from a small business standpoint? It's financial, right? And I know it probably isn't a surprise to anyone that financial loss by a company is consistently the primary motivator for change. So for good reason, if you can't stand to lose several $1,000s based on a breach, then that should be good motivation for upping your security game, right? Now, over the years, financially motivated attacks have been consistently more and more the focus. And I can actually, demonstrate that to you. Here you see on the left side in 2016, around less than 75% of breaches were financially motivated. It was mostly espionage. And over the couple years, it's all the way up into the, the 80s and 90s, 90%, I should say, of all attacks are now financially focused. And if you are the kind of person that needs to say, okay, so what does that mean to me specifically? In this Verizon data breach investigation report that came out in 2020, this is just focusing on last year, the average cost for business email compromise was ranging anywhere between $250 for a single email compromise incident. And for those that don't know, business email compromise generally comes in the form of, hey, it's your secretary, the boss wants you to buy some Visa gift cards and send it to them in a picture, right? So they somehow convince someone using social engineering in order to send money. And I wish it wasn't that simple, but literally all they have to do is just send an email and say like, hey, so-and-so needs you to send a Visa gift card so I can buy a gift for a client, right? So that's a simplistic look at business email compromise. And then on the top end of the scheme, we're looking at close to $1 million. And those are generally more complex and sophisticated social engineering attacks. But if a single incident or a series of incidences could cause your organization $1 million in damages, I don't know, it could be more, rationale for needing to implement good cyber hygiene, right? And then if we look at the second one, this computer database breach or computer data breach, that's anywhere between $150 and $1.5 million. So unless you have that kind of petty cash lying around and you have it in your business plan to be able to make up that difference. And then there's these existential costs that come with an incident as well. So you see forensics usually costs between $2,000 and $300,000. And then if you need to talk to a lawyer and try and settle a dispute with your clients or customers, or maybe they lost PII and you have to pay a fine, that's going to cost you anywhere between $800,000 and $50,000. And then again, as Colonial Pipeline learned, that ransomware can cost up into the hundreds of millions of dollars. So if you want to talk dollars and cents, good cyber hygiene makes good financial sense, right? So moving on. So there obviously, most organizations are not going to say, okay, yes, that makes sense, let's do it now, right? There's some challenges that are around trying to implement these basic security measures. And oftentimes it's simply a budgeting issue, right? We just don't have the resources to buy updated firewalls, right? So we're stuck with the ones we have, and maybe we aren't prioritizing increasing our IT budget, so we can't hire more security folks, right? So sometimes it's just a matter of dollars and cents, and it's not that we don't want to make these changes, it's just that we don't have the ability to. And then alternatively, there's culture, right? Sometimes there's a culture problem. If leadership doesn't prioritize application hardening, and the folks that are implementing new security features will be less inclined to actually ask about them. So a good example of this is something like, hey, we need to push this update. Our competitors have already upgraded all of these systems and we want to stay competitive, right? Well, if you haven't gone through the standard patch management and change management process, then that update that you're pushing to production might contain security flaws, right? So this culture of connect first, ask security questions later is generally the undoing of many organizations, right? So next, there's difficulty defining and standardizing security controls. And I'm going to kind of take a step back, and you're going to hear me say security controls a lot today. So let me kind of just drop a little knowledge onto what that is. Security controls are anything that an organization can do to reduce or mitigate a security risk. And these can be preventative. And in this case, let's say it's like locking your front door, right? So you're going to do your due diligence, you're going to lock your front door, and that's going to prevent people from walking in. Another type of security control can be detective. So let's say you have a Ring camera, and it's going to record anyone that goes to your door. So you've protected it by locking it, and now you're going to detect when someone walks up to your door. And then you also have the third type is called corrective. And then a corrective control is installing a smart lock so that when your teenager has inadvertently left the door unlocked, you can go in remotely and lock that door, right? So you saw someone leave and they never locked the door, you can actually correct it, right? And then the last type of control is called a deterrent. And that's that big dog that you have in the front yard. So the dog is going to deter people from coming onto your property. And then you have, in case they do get past the scary dog, you have that protective control, right? So when I say difficulty defining controls, that means that you, being the CEO or the ISO or a CTO or just a security person, will be in charge of picking which controls need to be placed in front of your organization to protect it. So let's say if you're the security manager and you need to pick which protective controls need to be placed in front of your public-facing website. Do you know which security controls to put there, right? Or with detective controls, you need to be placing those inside your network. So if a bad guy were to get in, you would be able to see them moving around, looking at servers and doing that kind of stuff, right? So those are the first three security challenges. The next one is creating and implementing security policies. So usually when I talk about security policy, I get a response of like a sad chuckle and be like, huh, what policy, right? Unfortunately, in theory, it's really good to have, but practically, it's kind of self-imposed requirements that a lot of organizations just have a hard time putting upon themselves, right? Sorry. Now, it's easy to it's easier if you are if you have state requirements or federal regulatory requirements that you need to meet, and I'll get to those in a second. But if you're a privately owned business and you're just trying to keep your head above water and trying to make an income, it's easy to understand why policy would be like low on the priority list, right? You're saying, okay, we need to make money, we need to do this. Why would we restrict ourselves in that fashion and make it more difficult to, do our day-to-day ops? So the last security control that's, challenge is testing those controls to make sure they work. Now, this is just an extra step that is often forgotten, but if you knew let's say in this, house scenario, right? So you did everything you could to protect your family's jewels, let's say like, heirlooms. And you would want to put some additional security on the inside of your house as well to make sure that those family heirlooms and family jewels can't be walked away with if someone were to break into your house. Now, if you did put them in a lockbox and that lockbox could just be like picked up and walked away with, that's not really doing you any good, right? So you would want to test it out, and if someone did break in, that lockbox is securely attached to the wall and no one can just like walk away with it. So by testing these kind of things and running scenarios, you can actually make sure that the controls you put into place are actually effective, right? So these are some of the challenges that a lot of organizations face that, it makes sense, right? It's they're common issues that everyone has to deal with. So where do you get started then, right? So I've talked about state security controls and regulatory organizations, but there's, this little slide, this eye chart, this slideshow is just a small fraction of the baseline frameworks, regulations that are floating around the world, right? GDPR is international, and a couple of these are international. And really the answer is to, you need to know thyself. You really need to understand which of these alphabet soups of regulatory agencies really apply to you. So maybe you are not specifically in like the healthcare industry, but you run a software that a healthcare organization ends up utilizing, right? Should you be concerned about HIPAA compliance, right? Who has the onus on that, right? Like who needs to make sure that that information, that secure healthcare information is being protected? Is it on the organization or it is on you, right? So I can't answer that for you. Obviously, every organization is going to be needing to know their own security, I guess, requirements. But this is just kind of to show you just how many different frameworks there are out there for which you can kind of start looking at. And I took this quote, it's not about the list, from the CIS top 18, which we're going to talk about briefly. And that's, page 2 in their instructions on how to implement the CIS top 18. And it's true, right? So security frameworks are a great starting place, but anyone can make a list, right? Like my husband makes a shopping list, right? But that I can look at the shopping list and be like, yep, I need to buy these things, but I'm still going to go and buy, delicious cheddar popcorn because it's my favorite. So it's not on the list. I'm still going to get it. And maybe I'm going to not get something else, even though he said we need more milk. I'm getting popcorn today, right? So it's not about the list. It's really about ensuring that the list is right for you, right? So ensure that whatever framework or regulatory guidance you end up using is right for your organization. Now, if you are a small mom and pop shop and your income is not going over $10,000, let's say yearly, you're not going to want to try and acquire a $20,000 solution like Splunk in order to protect your organization, right? So you need to think right scaled. And then it doesn't just need to be scaled correctly, it also needs to be aligned with your unique regulatory requirements, okay? So if you again have HIPAA requirements, then there is a nice list of, HIPAA does give you that information and in order for you to use in order to know what is important for you and those specific security requirements. Now, you can have the list of requirements and you can make sure they're scaled right, but if you're not actually applying training and basically giving it to your organization in order to familiarize themselves with, then it's not worth using, right? So if I'm an ISO and I say, hey, I've heard about this great security framework, it's awesome, I want to learn all about it, then maybe that's not in the cards this year, but as the CIO, I can prioritize it for next year's training budget, right? So you need to make sure that the training is available and then that you can train the trainer and essentially push that information down, right? And then additionally, you need to make sure that whatever framework you choose and whatever kind of regulatory information you have, it's actually maintainable and repeatable with the resources you have. So again, right, this comes back to budget. If I have a one-person team and they are responsible for not just patching, but also managing and then upgrading, and then, hey, there's this new latest and greatest we want to put in there. If they can barely manage their time and maintain all of these things, you can't really expect them to also heap on regulatory compliance, right? So it really does need to be whatever controls you choose and whatever kind of information you go with, it really does need to be maintainable with whatever limited resources you have. And then finally, what you do choose does need to support those business and operational goals, right? So obviously, if I am a state or local territory and my goal is just to, you know, protect the information of my clientele, whatever that clientele is, then that's going to be my focus. I'm not going to really worried about losing money. I'm not, because I'm a state agency, right? Or if I'm a, you know, a federal component, then I'm going to have operational goals to make sure that my federal component has been meeting their obligations, right, to support other federal governments. So all of this to say, I'm going to kind of throw a lot of information at you and just kind of keep these things in mind, that no matter what you learn about today and whatever kind of federal organizations or regulatory requirements that you start looking into, that you just kind of make sure that it's right sized for you. So I'm about halfway through and we haven't even looked at anything, and that's important, right? So the reason is I'm going to start small and kind of work my way out. There's this people, process, and technology trifecta. And this PPT framework, it has been around since the 60s, but it was really popularized in the early 2000s. And I like to say that in this case, PPT is all about balance, right? A three-legged stool, all that kind of thing, right? So with people, process, and technology, it's kind of showing us this awesome Venn diagram of the three major components that make organizations work, right? And this can be applied to any organization, right? You look at Taco Bell, you look at the Pete's Coffee down the road, right? It doesn't matter how big the organization is, it really does rely on people and process and technology. And I feel, because I'm a relationship-based person, that people should always be on top, right? So our main focus should be on the people. And whether that's your employees, or if that's your clients, or if that's the end users, we should always maintain people as the top priority. And then, because that fosters two things, right? So if we look in these subsections here, that's going to foster good culture. And again, I mentioned culture earlier, which is security culture. And then it's also going to foster innovation, right? So if you have an organization that has the room and the creativity to innovate, then they are going to innovate, right? But in order to do that, they really need to have the technology in order to do that. And I think it's worth mentioning that technology is not the 100% of the solution. I know a lot of organizations just kind of think, well, I'm going to slap a Band-Aid on it. In this case, the Band-Aid is a firewall, right? We have a security issue, so we're just going to slap yet another, you know, access control list on top, and then that's going to limit the amount of people that can see it. So now that's not a big issue. And yes, technology can help with innovation, and it can also help with automation. But again, technology is not the end all be all. And then the third leg of this stool is process. And I don't think I need to say it, but process really always should start at the top, right? So if we have a process for creating a better work culture, that should be started from the top down, and it should not have to come from the bottom up. The bottom in this case is generally the folks that are actually doing the work, right? So they're the ones that are turning the screwdriver, or they're the ones that have hands on keyboards. And a lot of times the process is developed out of a sense of, we got to do it, right? We need to do the thing, whatever the thing is. And in order to do the thing, we need to really have a standardized process. And those are generally created ad hocly and then forwarded up to organizations to say, hey, this thing is working really well. Can we implement it across the board? So in a nutshell, people, process, and technology is really optimizing the interaction, right, between these three things. And if you can find that balance, then you can find that golden success for an organization. And I start with PPT, and obviously this isn't like a step-by-step instruction. It's just more to try and keep an eye on, as I'm throwing some more of these terminology, these security controls at you, to kind of understand that there is a balance to all things, and you can't just slap a security control on top of something, because generally people will kind of mess up that process to say, oh, we had a control in place, but Bob let someone in from the back door, right? So he mitigated the process, and that monkeyed up the works, right? So the next framework we're going to kind of briefly go over is the NIST cybersecurity framework. And the National Institute of Standards and Technology, their job is to kind of, they really set the standard for all things security. And to some folks, this graph might look familiar, right? If you have been in the security space at all, or if you're just interested in how things are done at other organizations, if it's not new to you, then, like, that's awesome. But I'm going to break this down, as best as I can. And there's these 5 security functions that really lay the groundwork for cyber hygiene, okay? And I'm going to foot stomp them each as I go through the next slide deck, because this is really the backbone for all things security, right? And they're you can say backbone, or you can say, like pillars. But the 5 functions, which each of these is a function, they really are the pillar to a successful and holistic cybersecurity program. And they can help organizations really express to their upper management cybersecurity risk at that high level, and enable management to make better security decisions. So the idea is that if you know that you need to protect your information, that's going to be a lot easier to understand as a CEO than to say, like, hey, we need to enable more firewall controls, and we need to set up random access measures and all this kind of stuff, right? We just need to say, hey, we need to protect our assets. So let's walk through these briefly. First, we've got identify. And identify function really assists in developing an organization's understanding for managing risk to systems, people, data, what have you, right? So what does this look like within an organization? We're going to talk about a couple of these in the upcoming slides, but it might look like hardware or software inventory, right? So you're identifying the software items, or you're identifying what hardware is on your system, right? And then that's also going to be a governance program, which more specifically, any cybersecurity policy you have in place. So you're going to identify the tasks or the processes that you need to protect with a policy, right? So then next we have protect. And the protect function supports that organization's ability to limit or contain the impact of a cybersecurity event, and then also outline safeguards for delivery of critical services. Now, within your organization, that might look like data classification. So if you can specify what kind of protected information, PII, needs to be protected, then you're going to classify that data, and then be able to have a better understanding of your risk factor, right? And then, or it could be, like some kind of security protection technology that's used to protect the confidentiality of your organization's information, right? So there's lots of ways that we can implement the protect step, but it could be something like an awareness and training program, right? So that's like really important to me personally, because I think that training is number one, right? And so in order to protect your organization, you need to train your workforce. Now, detect, that is defining the appropriate activities to identify an occurrence of a cybersecurity incident in a timely fashion, right? And I say in a timely fashion because historically, security breaches took months in order to detect. And thankfully, based on the 2020 information that we got from the Verizon report, that amount of time to detect an incident has been going down dramatically, where it used to be like maybe 3 months, now it's only 3 weeks, and then soon it's going to be like 10 days, right? So the average response time for detection of an event is going down. And in your organization, that might look like a continuous monitoring program, like a SIEM or where you can actually look at events on your network and say like, oh, hey, this was malicious, right? I can tell from all of these different factors that this is a malicious event. And then also, detection can also just be testing and verifying the effectiveness of those preventative measures that we put in place. So in step 1, we identified something that needs to be shored up. In step 2, we protected it with some kind of control. And now in step 3, we're actually going to test it to see if it worked, right? So we're going to detect the effectiveness of that control. Next, we've got respond. And respond is those appropriate activities that take place after a detected incident has occurred in order to minimize the impact. So let's say you were going through your network logs and you noticed something fishy was happening. Well, if you don't have an incident response plan already set up, that security person is going to spend a lot of time just wasting time, I should say, contacting a security person and saying like, hey, I found this, what do I do, right? And then they have to research it, and then they have to do that kind of stuff. So respond with a plan is super important because you really do need to understand the appropriate order of operation in order to protect your organization. Colonial Pipeline actually understood that, and they contacted the FBI as soon as they had a ransomware. And then what happened was the FBI was able to make the payment with them, or along with them, and then get that money back, right? So even though Colonial Pipeline paid the ransomware, because they worked with the FBI and they had an incident response plan, they were able to actually recoup the loss of those millions of dollars in ransomware because the FBI was able to track where that money went and then stop it from being transferred again, right? So that's a good example of just how a positive impact that can come from following these steps. And then the last step here is recover. And the recover step, or function, I should say, really identifies the type of actions taken to maintain resilience, right? If we have a resilient organization, then we should be able to restore the services that were impaired during a cybersecurity incident. And in your organization, that's probably going to look something like a disaster recovery plan, or a process or a procedure. And then having that disaster recovery plan, that's also going to be able to implement lessons learned if we were going to do a dry run or a test, right? So if we do a test outage, and I know actually just the other day, a lot of the internet went out, and a lot of the internet went down because of a simple configuration change on a system, right? So a lot of organizations were caught flat-footed or off guard. So does your organization have the ability to quickly respond to that outage and then recover from it, right? And then what does that recovery look like? So if you're going to take away anything from this slide, it would hopefully be to understand that these 5 security functions exist, right? That you can actually look at them and say, oh, okay, well, I know what that is. And then be able to see how that they are used to help secure your organization, right? So yes, they exist. I understand how I can use them at a high level, and then, know that they can be used to quickly recover from an incident, whether it's malicious or just that unplanned outage, right? So I've got about 5 minutes left and like 10 slides. And I did this for a reason, because I'm not going to really go into depth with this next bit, which is the CIS controls. I really just wanted to hit them on a high level, speak through them, and hope that it intrigues you enough to just really be able to like want to look into it more, right? I really want to spark your curiosity. So the CIS controls, it used to be the CIS top 20. And as of a couple weeks ago, maybe 2 weeks ago, it is now actually the CIS top 18. And that's because CIS, the Center for Internet Security, they released their version 8 of the security controls. And the CIS top 18 now, they've broken them down into these different implementation groups. And implementation group 1, or IG1, is really that focus of that basic cyber hygiene. That's what CIS is going for. And implementation group 1 is focused at small to medium-sized organizations with limited IT and security expertise. So who is that? That can be, again, right, a small mom and pop shop, medium-sized organization, it really depends on what you see as size, right? Is that personnel or is that income, right? Are we a higher value target if we make a large income, even though we are a physically small organization, right? So the reason why it's worded in this fashion is because each organization should really own the process of defining if they are an IG1, IG2, or IG3. So an implementation group 2, there are certain controls that you're going to put into place for IG1. You're going to include those controls for implementation group 2. And implementation group 2, those are organizations that have individuals that are responsible for managing and protecting IT infrastructure. So if you can say to yourself, hey, we call ourselves a medium-sized business, but our IT department is actually quite large, and their only function is to protect our IT infrastructure, then maybe you would consider yourself an IG2. And an IG2 would use these controls to help their security team cope with that increased operational complexity, right? So whereas IG1 thwarts general non-targeted attacks, IG2 really looks at, we're introducing some new attack vectors, right? Opportunities to an organization by essentially, just the fact that we have a complex organization. So IG2 is going to implement IG1 controls and IG2 controls. And then similarly, implementation group 3 will include those two and the remainder of the controls. In this case, it's 18 controls instead of 20 now. And implementation group 3 is an organization that has security experts that are specialized in cybersecurity, right? So that's going to be an organization like Amazon, like Google, that just, like their whole bread and butter is security, right? Apple. And the IG3 controls are really aimed to stop those targeted, sophisticated attacks from an adversary, such as Russian nation states and ransomware and that kind of thing, right? So the implementation groups 1, 2, 3, the difference between the CIS top 20, which the way it used to be was you only had to do the first 4 or 5 controls if you were IG1, but not anymore. Now what they do is they basically take a layer of each cake, or basically a layer of each of these controls, and they say if you're IG1, you're just going to do the first couple things in this list, but you're going to do, for the most part, all 18. And what's the benefit to using a framework such as NIST, such as CIS? And that's because they can be used independently, right? So if you have HIPAA, and that's all you do is HIPAA compliance, then you can use HIPAA by itself and then take pieces of a framework and just kind of like layer them on top, right? Or if I just want to be using the CIS controls and I don't have to worry about anything else, they really do have the flexibility and the capability of being used solo. But they can also be built on top of each other, right? So if you want to take a piece of this framework and a piece of that framework and put them all together, that's really just the type of trifle, right, that you want, the security trifle that can be built one on top of each other, right? So I'm going to take a slice of this and a slice of this, and it's going to be delicious, right? The next benefit of a security framework is that they do have that low implementation cost, right? The cost of putting in a policy is time, right? Or the cost for training is one person learning about a security, I guess, mechanism like phishing and teaching it to their people, right? So frameworks are cheap as free, right? They're readily available. You can go and get a PDF and just start reading about them. And then another great feature is that you can implement some or all of the controls, but you still win, right? So let's say you take control 1 and control 5, and you're just going to focus on those two things, but you still benefit because your security is that much more enhanced, right? And then finally, a security framework is great because there's standards that every organization can benefit from, right? So there's not intrinsically one is more beneficial than the other. A state agency would benefit from it just as much as a private agency, right? So I'm mentioning all this, and I'm going to wrap up soon, but I just want to kind of talk about the other side of the house, right? So we've kind of talked about all of these security features and all of this security stuff, but it's kind of important, I think, to also look at why we have to do this, right? Like, why does the bad guy have an advantage over us, right? And it's sad to say, but the adversaries of today, right, the bad guys, the threat actors, as we call them, they have powerful tools that are really available to anyone on the internet. There's something that's called ransomware as a service now, right? And the idea of ransomware as a service is really scary because people will benefit from just attacking your organization, right? And in that case, they do have advances in technology and affordable computing platforms that are available to anyone to launch attacks. And something that we've learned from like the Russian nation states is that they're taking the money that they're getting from ransomware and investing that in more powerful computers in order to try and break your passwords and to try and crack computer, algorithms and that kind of thing, right? So they're benefiting monetarily from your ransomware attack, but then they're taking that money and investing it in themselves in order to better attack you, right? And the bad guys really do have little skill or training in order to initiate these extremely harmful attacks. And they're called script kiddies, where basically any kid with a computer can basically go in and hit a button and then like infiltrate your network, right? But the result of that is that the sophistication of the attacks is growing, but the skill of the attacker is not, right? And we can kind of take to heart that while that sophistication and the difficultiness to anticipate an attack is going up, like it's more and more difficult to anticipate attack. But again, with good cyber hygiene, we can actually mitigate that attack by just doing these very small level things. And I'm going to run through them very briefly because I know we only have 10 minutes left and I want to be able to have that Q&A. So I'm just going to click through and kind of show you what implementation group 1 cyber hygiene looks like for that CIS top 18. There are things like inventory and control of assets, and that's that identify group, where you're looking at lists of authorized and unauthorized devices and software, right? So I'm grouping 1 and 2 here together. And then once you've identified those items, then you're going to create a process to address unauthorized devices and software. Data protection, right? So you're going to identify data that's in your system, and you're going to create a secure data security process. And then you're going to protect that data with secure destruction or data retention periods, right? So we're only going to keep sensitive data for a year. So again, these are just implementation group 1 controls, and I'm not going to go, obviously I don't want to go into these at all. I'm just kind of showing you the expectations that were you to look more into this, these are the kind of things that you would need to do, right? Secure configuration process. So if you have laptops that are deployed to your entire workforce, they should all have the same security controls, right? So account management, we're looking at privileged users, protect your unique passwords, and everyone's going to get a copy of these slides so you can go through them in detail if you want. Access control management, that's the 6th one. Continuous vulnerability management. And then audit logs, again, like if you're not logging your data, you're not being able to go through and look at those network attacks. And then email and web browser, you know, are you using fully supported browsers? Malware defense, do you have anti-malware software? Data recovery. So this is a big one because with ransomware, the way it's at right now, the attackers are not just locking up your live data, they've also started locking up your recovery data. So if you don't have your recovery data protected, then you're not going to be able to better respond to a ransomware, because even though you're saying like, hey, we're protecting our data, it's not really data protected because they're just going to encrypt that too, right? And then this is the first example of a control that's not included in implementation group 1, right? Well, oh, okay, sorry, we lost our PowerPoint. But that's fine because we were going to jump to our Q&A anyways. So all of this to say, yeah, sorry about that. Probably that was a crash. So thankfully I was almost done anyways. I want to thank you for going through and like looking at those with me. But the majority of my big focus was just on the frameworks about understanding cyber hygiene. And when we do send those training slides out, take a look at the top 18, right? So I want you to really look at the actual controls that can be placed on your organization. So I will kick it back to Jillian if she wants to facilitate the Q&A with the 8 or so minutes I left you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Britt. Yes, folks, please go ahead, start sending in your questions. And just to remind you, we are sending out that slide deck, so you'll be able to get to go through that at your leisure and take your time. But okay, we have one question for you, Britt. What's the easiest security control that we can start with?
Yes. So I mentioned training, right? So I feel like training is the easiest to start with, specifically because it has 3rd and 5th order effects, right? So even just getting an organization or tool like KnowBe4. So that's my go-to recommended, you know, security expertise. KnowBe4 is definitely a great place to start because it's, you know, you get training for your individuals. You check the box on that security awareness training that everyone needs to get done every year. And then also you can use simulated phishing tools in order to actually test, right? So we have the security control of we're going to train our individuals. And then again, with the check, right, we're going to check that that control worked by testing you, by sending you simulated phishing. So to me, I think that's the most important because you know, employees are normally the problem, right? So if we can kind of mitigate that issue, that would probably be the best one to start with.
Perfect. Yeah, actually, Bender uses KnowBe4, and it's been very beneficial. So
yeah,
can speak to that. All right, another question we have is we don't have the budget to add more IT staff. What can we do with limited personnel?
So in that case, I think policy is always, my go-to, because again, it costs nothing, right? And generally, policy is going to can be created by a single person, right? So SANS is a really great resource to go through and get sample policies. And that's basically the de facto standard on security policy is SANS. And you can basically take their ready-made templates, go through, start looking at them and saying like, what is logical for my organization, right? So if I'm a large business, do I really need to be, should I be implementing two-factor authentication? And the answer is almost always yes, right? So the short answer is policy is cheap and policy doesn't need IT. Now, in order to implement the contents of the policy, you're normally going to be needing a couple folks that are smart about it, right? So maybe just do the policies that aren't going to require you to start putting in new firewalls and new kind of like security event monitoring tools, right? So I hope that kind of gets you off the right foot.
Great. We have a question here that asks, how many of the top 18 tools are recommended for IG1?
So I want to say it was all 18 minus 12, 14, and 18. So it was basically like, 14 of the controls. And I think for most organizations, by starting with just number one, right? So they're ranked in an area of priority still. So if you don't know where to start, you're completely uninitiated to the whole security process, again, know thyself, right? So that's the biggest thing. So if you don't know how many accounts you have, network accounts on your computer, then that's a good place to start, right? Because I have actually seen it, and I hate to say this, in a previous organization, they had a back-end access that was accessible via the internet that was protected using the username admin and the password admin, right? So if you don't know that there's an administrative password on the back end of your web server, and that's, and you're not talking to your folks about password management and how often those things are changed, then that's going to be an easy attack vector, right? That's what we call it. So I feel like starting with one and just like one thing I wasn't able to show you in my presentation before it died was what actions can you take? And I think the number one action you can take is to just have a goal, right? I'm going to implement control number one in the next year. Like that's my goal, and that's all you have to focus on. But have a 3-year plan, right? So like if I say by the end of year one, I want to have my inventory of my software and all my network accounts. By the end of year 2, I want to have a robust security training program and a policy that enforces it, right? So just by setting those nice small milestones, you're going to really set yourself up for success.
Perfect. Thank you.
Yeah.
Another question, would you recommend password expirations alongside MFA or 2FA or non-expiring passwords with 2FA/MFA?
So I always defer to what NIST usually will recommend, and the NIST requirement or this risk recommendation right now is if you have complex 18-character passwords, they do not need to expire, right? So the answer is always MFA all the time, right? So like no matter what, whether you have expiring or non-expiring, always MFA. And then on top of MFA, if you have over 18 characters, you could probably go get around with saying they don't have to expire. If you want to have less than 18 characters, then you're going to want to have that 3 or 6 month expiration period.
Perfect. And
Yeah.
it is 11 o'clock, so I think we'll go ahead and wrap up the Q&A section. But again, thank you, Britt, for sharing with us today. It was absolutely incredible. We appreciate all of you for taking time out of your busy schedules to join us for today's BenderU on how to keep your organization clean with good cyber hygiene. And remember, we have recorded this session. We're gladly sharing the link to the recording as well as a copy of the slide deck after the webinar has concluded. And we know that questions do pop into our brains after these webinars wrap up, so please feel free to reach out to us, and we'll be happy to connect you with Britt or Brian and get your questions answered. So thank you again, everybody, and we hope you have a wonderful day and hope to see you at a future BenderU.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Britt.